Welcome to Disciple Dojo. This morning, I had a chance to sit down and talk with Dr. Rebecca Idestrom, who is professor of Old Testament at Tyndale Seminary at Tyndale University in Toronto. So another Canadian guest here in the dojo. Dr. Idestrom is the author of Show Me Your Glory, the Glory of God in the Old Testament. And I read this a couple of weeks ago and said, hey, would love to have you on the channel to talk about it. I put out a questionnaire here on the channel. I posted it and asked for those of you with questions that you could submit your questions, and I'd ask them to Dr. Idestrom. So there were a couple of the viewer questions that we asked at the end of our discussion, so stay tuned for that. See if your question made the cut. And the way that people found out that we were having her on and that I was taking questions is that they were subscribed to the channel and they had enabled notifications. If you do that, whenever Disciple Dojo posts something, it shows up on your feed. YouTube lets you know, hey, this is what's going on. If you don't do that, you may not see when we do things like this or like our live stream, which we have one coming up next Tuesday, May 28th. 2024. You may be watching this much later. We're going to be doing another Disciple Dojo open mat live stream. That's where I hop on. Our friend Gregory from Bible Hacking gets on and helps me kind of do the production stuff. And we just take questions from viewers. So any questions you want to ask, hop on that live stream next Tuesday night, 7 p.m. Eastern time. But the only way you know about things like that, like I said, is you enable notifications whenever you subscribe to this channel. So if you haven't already done that, we would really appreciate it if you do. This is a great discussion. I hope you enjoy it. The concept of God's glory is a very mysterious and misunderstood concept. So it's great having someone who spent literally 15 years of her life researching and studying it to share her knowledge here in the dojo. I hope you appreciate it. Let's talk with Dr. Rebecca Idestrom. Folks, we are here with Dr. Rebecca Idestrom. Is that how you say it? Idestrom?
Well, my dad says Idestrom. My brothers say Idestrom. In Sweden, it's Idestrom, but in Canada, more people find it easier to say Idestrom. So I go by both, to be honest.
Okay. Well, Dr. Idestrom, whichever viewers prefer. It's great to have you. She is the author of the book, Show Me Your Glory, the Glory of God in the Old Testament. And that's what we're going to be talking about today is this concept of God's glory. And before we jump in, let's introduce you. Who are you? Where do you teach? And how did you end up spending, I assume, years of your life researching and ultimately writing a whole book on God's glory in the Old Testament?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I thank you very much for letting me be part of this channel. I'm privileged and feel honored about that. So my name is Rebecca, and I'm originally from Sweden, but I've lived in Canada for most of my life since 9 turning 10. So, I'm professor of Old Testament at Tyndale Seminary, which is part of Tyndale University in Toronto. Mm-hmm. And when I first started off in my educational journey, I never thought I would be teaching Old Testament or Hebrew. My whole family are musical, so I'm musical as well. So I thought I would be studying music in university, things like that. But I ended up going to Bible college for 4 years in Saskatoon. And while I was there, someone was telling us about going to Israel for a year. So I ended up going to Israel and study at the Hebrew University. Mm-hmm. And that was my Damascus Road experience in the sense that it changed the direction of my life. Of course, I was a Christian, but it just turned around my thinking, and I fell in love with Hebrew, both modern and biblical Hebrew, and the Bible and archaeology and history. And so when I came back to Canada, I ended up pursuing Jewish studies and history at the University of Toronto, and then a master's in Old Testament at Wycliffe College, which is part of University of Toronto. And then I went to Sheffield University in England for a PhD. And then I taught at a Bible college on the West Coast for 5 years. And then I ended up in Toronto teaching at Tyndale Seminary. And I've been there for 23 years. So it's been a while.
That's awesome. Yeah. What was it? Let me interrupt and just ask you, what was it about? Because, being a Christian, a lot of people think, oh, if you're Christian, you focus on the New Testament. And so I actually will have viewers sometimes who are Jewish who will say, I didn't even know Christians studied the Old Testament. Like they're almost surprised that Christians
Right.
fall in love with the Hebrew Bible. What was it in particular for you that led you down that path? Like what was it that was pulling at you about the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I also studied Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew, but it was really studying biblical Hebrew in the context of a living language in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University. I just realized this is a living language; it's not a dead language, and it just opened up the whole window. I mean, language is a way of communicating culture, and
Yeah.
just understanding the culture of the Old Testament through the Hebrew language was really the that started the journey
Hmm.
for me. Yeah, and uh, yeah, and I just feel like, okay, I mean, I'm very passionate about the Old Testament, and I feel like my students are often afraid of the Old Testament because of the huge, big testament and
Yeah.
the complexity of it and things
Yeah.
like that. But I want to, this is three-quarters of our Bible, and we shouldn't be neglecting three-quarters of our Bible, right?
Right.
And for us to realize this is our story, it's not just Israel's story. It is our story too. And I
Mm.
actually don't think you can fully understand the New Testament without understanding the Old Testament and various concepts in the Old Testament, which of course the New Testament adopts lots of Old Testament language, right? And even
Right.
to know how Jesus is the Messiah. Why do we even need a Messiah? Why do we have the sacrificial system? All of those things. Why did Jesus have to die? It's all
Mm.
explained from the Old Testament. So
Yeah.
I just um, yeah, but it started from being in Israel and learning the language and doing the archaeology and all of that too as
Yeah.
well.
Did
Yeah.
you have any, what level was your Hebrew before you went over and studied in Israel?
Actually, I didn't know any Hebrew then. I had only studied Greek.
Okay.
Uh,
So you were full immersion.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, because the Hebrew, modern Hebrew at the Hebrew University is it's like French immersion here in Canada.
mhm.
Yeah, they're teaching Hebrew and the grammar in the language. So initially you just feel lost because you're trying to figure out what are they actually saying. They're
Right.
explaining the Hebrew in Hebrew,
Yeah.
but eventually, because you're hearing it, you're submerged in it.
Right.
Uh, it came alive, and I actually teach Hebrew that way now, biblical Hebrew. That you need to read it out loud. You need to sing it. We sing
Uh,
scripture in Hebrew. You need to visualize it. Like there's got to be a whole body experience for learning language. So I teach
yeah.
Hebrew as biblical Hebrew as a living language. Yeah.
That's great because that's one of the biggest challenges I noticed, and people that viewers that don't know how languages work in seminary settings. A lot of times, seminaries are so focused on preparing people for ministry and getting them through their degree and getting them into ministry that they teach the language with the goal of like getting you into the text as fast as
Right.
possible, where you
Right.
start parsing and looking up lexicons and doing word studies and you don't. So what you learn how to do, and I tell people when they ask, do you read Hebrew, I say I decipher Hebrew. I can't, for me it's not a living language. I struggle. I'm okay with it, but it takes me a long time because I didn't learn it as, I learned it over two intensive summer courses, like 8 weeks basically was all of my first year Hebrew. And
Right.
so it was just because of the nature of how it's taught in those seminaries that do require the languages. A lot of times people learn it not as a language
Mhm.
of communication, but as a language of deciphering. So I can
Yeah.
see what this text means, and then so
Yeah.
I can preach it to somebody else. So there are a lot of Hebrew tools and Greek tools out there, especially on YouTube now, that are starting to really move in the direction of
Yeah.
teaching it that way.
Exactly. And in fact, there is actually several professors who created grammars that are much more like a living language, and
Hmm.
there's actually sessions at SBL and ETS that focus on that approach to more the second language and acquisition theories and all of that as well.
Yeah.
So
That's
yeah.
wonderful. And you mentioned SBL. SBL last year is where you and I met. Our friend Richard Middleton connected us, and he was who said, "Hey, you need to have her on and talk to her." And so then you reached out to me about your book, and I was like, "Yes, let's do it. Let me read it." And so your book, the book for viewers is called "Show Me Your Glory," and it's a biblical theology, or Old Testament Hebrew Bible theology of the concept of God's glory. And it doesn't trace it into the New Testament. It is focused on the Hebrew Bible. Why this topic? What got you motivated to? How many years? Or I assume it took more than a year to write a book of this
Oh,
size.
yeah, well, actually, it took 15 years. So it's like it took a huge part of my life, really,
Right.
to work on this book.
So
Um,
what was it about God, the concept of God's glory in the Hebrew Bible that
yeah.
drew you in to spend 15 years of your life studying it?
So first of all, it came out of my teaching because I teach courses on the book of Isaiah. I teach courses on the book of Ezekiel, on the Psalms, and of course, in my Old Testament theology and history, we're dealing with the Pentateuch and other, parts of the Old Testament. But those are the parts of the Old Testament that speak the most about God's glory. So
Right.
I started noticing how much glory language there are in these books and the prophets of Isaiah, Ezekiel, and of course in the Pentateuch and Psalms. But then I also was really intrigued by the answer that and the experience that Moses had when he asked or prayed to the Lord, "Show me your glory." And that's why I entitled the book that way, "Show me your glory." Because I was just when he says, "Show me your glory" in chapter 33, God's response is, "I'm going to show you all my goodness." And I'll proclaim my name, and I'll have mercy upon who has mercy. I'll show compassion, whom I have compassion. And then when the actual theophany happens in chapter 34, then again he's proclaiming his name and talking about being, you know, steadfast love and patience and justice and all the kind of characteristics of Yahweh, the divine attributes. So it made me realize that the answer to what is God's glory is not just a visible manifestation of His presence. That we do see a lot in the Pentateuch, especially.
Mhm.
But it's also something maybe we might think is more intangible, but it's a revelation of who God is, His character of mercy and goodness and compassion and steadfast, loyal, chesed,
Mhm.
love, right? All of that is part of what it means to talk about God's glory. But then, so I realized that when I was starting to look at passages, that different passages talked about God's glory in different ways. Like sometimes it talked about God's glory being revealed in redemption or His redemptive acts, or
Mhm.
so in the Exodus, for example. But other times it is more in what you might call intangible, like just that you're going to see God's glory in the provision of the manna and the quail in Exodus 16.
Mhm.
It mentions that you're going to see the glory of God and then the provision in that context. So, and then references to God's character as well. So I just realized that there's actually diversity in the scriptures itself
Mhm.
about God's glory.
Yeah.
And the reason why it took so long is to work on this for 15 years. Part of it had to do with it's such a huge topic, and as I kept working on it, it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I wondered, what did I get into? I'm thankful to the Lord that I didn't know how long this would take
Right.
before I started, because I might not have started. Um, and then secondly, I had actually had two major health crises along the way,
Hmm.
which slowed down the project. And this is kind of interesting story. I I found out that I had to have surgery, and I actually had a benign brain tumor
Wow.
in 2016, and thankfully it was benign. It wasn't cancerous, but I had to have brain surgery. But
Hmm.
I had been invited to Durham University to give a paper on the glory of God in Exodus. And that conference was called Exploring the Glory of God. And that's actually been published, the papers from that conference.
Hmm.
And I actually asked the surgeon to postpone the surgery so I could go, because I was thinking, if this is the last thing I'm going to do before, in case something went wrong in that surgery, I actually went and redid my will. I just want to talk about God's glory. So he agreed. I flew to Durham, did my paper, and came home and had surgery 2 days later. And
Wow.
obviously, God spared my life. I'm still here. I'm still teaching. But my desire to understand God's glory has been also personal on this journey. Show me your glory. May I be transformed by your glory. So it's been a long journey, but and there were times I didn't think I'd finish it, but I'm thankful I was able to finish it by
Yeah.
God's grace and to His glory. Yeah.
I was going to say that whole incident is exhibiting the glory of God in all of it. Let's talk about on page 9 of the book. You mentioned the concept, and you talk about Mark Boda brought it up, the concept of a word view. We hear the phrase worldview a lot, but you mentioned a word view, which is where you take a theological theme and kind of exploring it, where a theological theme is expressed through a variety of different lexical means. What is, for viewers, I've read the book, they haven't, give them a quick understanding of what do you mean by word view, and why is it important when we're looking at something like the kavod, the glory of God?
So first of all, Mark Boda is a good friend of mine, and we were talking about this topic, and he actually told me, about this concept of word view, and he got it from Kevin Van Hooser. But anyway, and he used it in his own writing. So it was in the context that when you're doing kind of tracing a theme in scripture, that it's not enough just to look at lexical meanings of a word, and like kavod, for example, or the synonyms of kavod. Or kavod is the Hebrew word for glory, or the most prominent. There are other synonyms as well. But it's not enough to look at what the dictionary or lexicon says, but that also has to include other concepts or images of glory, or God as judge and God as divine king and judge, and other kind of metaphors, as well as various concepts. So in other words, you're not just looking for the words of glory in the scripture. You got to look at other clues and what other images are there. And so then you can talk about the pillar of cloud and fire as a manifestation of God's presence. And you could talk about the divine kingship of Yahweh as a God of the King of glory, whose kingdom is full of glory and all of that. So I introduced that in the context of that chapter where I'm talking about various nuances, various images, and all kinds of concepts that become associated with God's glory. And I know it's not a common word, but it was more that it kind of fills in a broader picture. Like, so I talk about filling in our horizon. And the semantic domain of glory becomes bigger and bigger as you look at glory through images and other related concepts and themes. So I tie it into what is when God's glory appears, how that relates to the redemption theme, or how God's glory is revealed in context of judgment, and so tying it into broader themes within Scripture as well. I also use the metaphor of a painting, right? That in Scriptures, each biblical writer is creating their own portrait or painting of God's glory by using all kinds of imagery and etc.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to touch on for viewers that are watching, is that's a great image of paint. My undergrad I have 2 degrees in painting as undergrad, and
I also paint, by the way.
Oh yeah, artist to artist. I love it. Yeah, so that's a great way to think of it. Is each. I mean, we think of this with the Gospels in the New Testament, like 4 different portraits of Jesus, basically. But the Old Testament works that way as well with these concepts. Like the frustration I have with language is when people have just enough language to actually misuse the text a little bit more. Like I did a study on glory and this is what it means. And then they, read Strong's Concordance dictionary thing of glory. And you're not getting what you're talking about. You're not getting the word view. You're not getting the semantic domain of glory. You're just grabbing one of the meanings, and then you end up reading that into all the other contexts where it may not even be what the author has in mind. We have a video here on the channel that my superhero figures behind me. One Professor He-Man does word study fallacies and presents like some common ways that the text gets misused, and a lot of them boil down to not doing what you're talking about, which is looking at the range of meanings that a word can have, and then deciding, okay, in this book, when this author uses this word, what do they mean, and how is it different from when this other author uses the word? So I appreciated that right up front, because you do go through, you survey a ton of texts in the book, and it's important to realize it's not a cookie cutter where you can just like plop the meaning in each instance. there's some fluidity.
That's right. And that's the reason why I organized it according to books, that there's a chapter on glory in Isaiah,
Right.
right? A chapter on glory in Ezekiel, because within each book, the writer, there's some diversity between the writers as well as connections as well, but each one is creating their own portrait or their own painting, so to speak, of the glory of God. And it's something I appreciated that Mark encouraged me to do that when I was doing this. And this is why the book is so big, because you could just easily draw out all the texts and just create a glory, like you said, a theology of glory. But we need to study these texts in context.
Right.
I mean, where meaning is derived from, is in context. That applies to communication, right?
Right.
To understand the nuance of a word or what we're meaning is we have to understand the context. And that's what I wanted to do. Okay, what does glory mean in this context of each book?
Yeah. And only then do you get a fuller understanding of the concept as a whole. And it's the opposite of, I don't know if it's the opposite, but it's a different way of doing it than proof texting, which is what most people are just familiar with. Just string all the verses that have the word glory in them together, and there you go. Completely ignoring the context. And so speaking about terms, you on page 19, you start talking about there's an excursus on the concept of the Shekinah, as a lot of people say it. And the Shekinah, you talked about how the rabbis in Second Temple era used it almost as a buffer term. What do you mean by a buffer term? Because that's an interesting concept.
So I put that excursus in about the concept Shekinah because I grew up in a context where everybody's talking about the Shekinah glory.
Right.
I don't think people know what they mean by Shekinah glory.
No,
right?
they don't.
They put those two words together, and I was actually thinking, the Shekinah, that Shekinah in Hebrew and Aramaic as well, it doesn't occur in the Old Testament at all. Like that word, of course, the shachan, the verb to dwell, is in the Bible, but this noun, Shekinah or Shekinah, is not there. And so why do we talk about Shekinah glory all the time? So I just thought I'd add a little section on that. And I'm not an expert on rabbinic literature, so I was relying on others, but it's a post-biblical development that the rabbis started talking about Shekinah really from the 2nd century AD onwards, where they use that concept. And it's, if I understand this correctly, it is because there was more reticence about, or hesitancy to speak about the immanence of God or God's direct intervention in the world, and that would not affect their view of the transcendence of God, right? So how do we talk about God's presence and activity in the world? And so the rabbis started using the word Shekinah for that. And so some use this term as a buffer, like it's sort of like lessening the shock if you put a buffer in between, like it's something in between or something indirect between just saying directly that God's glory is in the temple or whatever, or his presence, but actually, sort of something in between, indirect, sort of protecting you from the direct equivalency, so to speak. So that's how I understood the rabbinic writings of speaking of Shekinah. So it's interesting if you read the Jewish Targums. So these are Jewish translations into Aramaic of texts from the Old Testament. And those Aramaic texts, when you look at the texts like Exodus 33 and 34, they're using the word Shekinah instead of glory or instead of kavod, or they'll use something like the Shekinah or the glory of my Shekinah. So they're substituting the word glory for Shekinah in those texts. So it's quite common for them to write about a Shekinah, but I just don't think we as Christians, when we use the term, we really know what we're talking about.
Yeah, when there were questions, I posted this on the YouTube channel and asked viewers what were your questions, and there were a few that had to do, and in my own conversations with people, that had to do with Shekinah, the Shekinah, what is that? Because it's one of those words, especially in maybe more charismatic circles or more gospel circles, that gets thrown around. And it's just a synonym for everything from like a literal, I know in some charismatic circles, they talk about an actual cloud appearing when people worship for long periods of time. And that's the Shekinah of God showing up. And then I know of one instance where a church would actually use a smoke machine and not tell people, which is just horribly deceptive. But then other people think of it as just anytime they feel the Spirit moving, oh, that's the Shekinah, and it's one of those terms like the fact that it's not mentioned in the Hebrew Bible is fascinating.
Yes.
That would just, I mean, some people may be pausing the video and going, wait, what? And running to a lexicon because they've built a whole theology of it, of a word that doesn't appear in there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, of course, the notion of God dwelling amongst people is very much associated with God's glory. So,
Right.
yeah, if people are thinking about it in that way, maybe that's okay. But, Jesus dwelt among us and,
Right.
see his glory, right? The full of grace and truth and all that. So those concepts of dwelling, but in general, we're not using it really. It's not a biblical concept. It's a rabbinic concept that we have popularized in our circles, I think.
Mm-hmm. And again, for those who don't have any Hebrew, Shekinah, it comes from Shachan, the verb that means to dwell, and that's also where we get the Mishkan, which is the actual tabernacle, the dwelling. So God, I've even heard some New Testaments translate John as, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us to try to preserve that link.
Yes.
But that's what it means, dwelling. And,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, on page 39, you talked about, and this is a passage that you said stuck out to you, Moses' request to see God's glory, and there you mentioned about why he would have asked. They'd already seen God's glory, right? At Exodus 19 and the giving of the 10 Commandments, the mountain is full of his glory. He's spent 40 days and 40 nights up there in God's presence. So what's going on after this golden calf incident that he asked to see God's glory one more time?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that. Why ask that question? He has seen it many times. But I mean, if you're looking at the passage in context, he's wrestling about God's presence going with them. And what's different is after the golden calf debacle in chapter 32. And also in verse 13, he's I found favor in your eyes and show me your ways, right? He talks about show me your ways, and then he prays, show me your glory in the midst of this, making sure God's going to go with them, and although there's some kind of insecurity. I mean, I don't know if that's the right word, but because of what happened,
right, the covenant seems to have been broken.
So I think he's just asking for reassurance, right? And reassurance that God's presence is going to be with them, in the larger context. And he's also interceding for the people and all of that, and asking to, because I found favor with you, can I, show me your ways and show me your glory. Like you get those two prayers in those verses right before this passage. What I'm not sure if Moses realized what a unique experience he really would have as a result of asking for that. Maybe that he just maybe needed reassurance. Okay, show me again that you're with me, things like that. But the fact that God says, okay, yes, I'm going to cause all my goodness to pass before you. I'm going to proclaim my name. I'm going to, show that I'm merciful and compassionate. And I mean, and so it's the experience he has is both, a physical experience, and it's very intimate because God is going to be with him. There's these, prepositions with him there, standing in the rock. I'm going to, you could argue that both the senses and all the senses are involved, both the oral, he will hear, he will see, you can almost argue for the sense of touch, and God's going to cover him, protect him, and all of that. So I think I'm not sure if Moses really knew what God is going to do, but I think that's what makes this unique for him too, is that becomes like a creed for Israel, this declaration of God's character that's repeated in many passages in Scripture. but also it's this experience that causes Moses' face to shine. Like he's seen God's glory before, but his face doesn't shine before in these other occasions. But this time he does as well, reflecting God's glory. So it definitely is a very unique experience, and whether he knew why, I think it's more in the context of reassurance that he needed reassurance of God's presence.
Yeah. Do you see any significance in, well, a couple of questions that I want to ask you as I think about the passage. One is that Moses says, "Show me," but when it actually happens, he doesn't see much. He hears more than anything. He hears the name, like it's the name Yahweh, Yahweh,
Yeah.
gracious, compassionate. Like, so he has to be shown something, and God says, actually, I'm going to tell you something, and it's having to do with the name, and then also the question that everybody asks. I'm sure every student you've ever had asks, why his back or his afterward, or however you translate, achare. Why not? He's already been on the cloud. God's already said, I speak to him mouth to mouth or face to face. So why in this instance is it like a somewhat limited view? Is there something theological maybe or contextual because of the state of the broken covenant? I don't know. What, you have any thoughts on that for?
Yeah, I mean, I interpret it more that he can't see God directly, right? He is getting a glimpse of God's glory, but it's not full on direct, right?
Right. Do you think that when Moses when he was on the mountain, was he seeing God direct, or even there was God veiled because of the smoke and the fire and everything?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I mean, I do think that no one can see God and live, that expression, but at the same time, I think that's in this context as well. You cannot see God directly but there are passages that say that they saw God and they
Right.
still lived, right? Even the elders sitting at the mountain,
Yeah.
although it doesn't describe what they see, they describe the feet or or
Hmm.
the platform and all of that. It isn't, again, it's indirect. And I do think with Moses, it's definitely indirect when it comes to with the smoke and the fire. All of that is actually, in some sense, concealing.
Right.
And he is seeing something with the fire because it looks like fire on the mountain, and all the smoke and the thunder and the blasting of trumpets. He also hears sound, right? But I think that is still indirect because God has to protect us. We can't see God fully in all his glory at all. So I would not argue that Moses had seen God fully before.
Right.
But I mean, it's using God, this kind of anthropomorphic language, human language to describe, God using his hand, his face, his back, right?
Mm.
In that context. So, and I do believe that he is experiencing God's glory because he says, I'm going to cause my glory to pass by. But then he says, when I pass by, right? There's a equation between glory and God. I will pass by. There are scholars who will say, no, he didn't get to see God's glory at all. Because of this picture, you can't see me, then you have to be hidden. But I actually think it's the text is saying the opposite. It is saying, yes, I give you permission to see my glory. I will pass by, but you need to be protected. You can't see me fully. So the afterwards, I mean, some people translate that more like the afterglow or sort of the contours of God, but you just don't see directly. You just see the outline, so to speak. I don't know if I would make it too much of I mean, it's not the normal word for back. It's more the word for after.
Right. It's an interesting, mysterious encounter, regardless of how anybody interprets it, for
That's
sure.
true. That's true.
But yeah, what you're talking about in your discussion made me think, like, yeah, is there a level of diminution, is there a level of distance that introduced in this account because of the distance between God and Israel and the broken covenant, that God is reassuring Moses, but also reassuring with a little bit more?
Although I guess I would not sure if I would agree with that interpretation from the point of view that Moses hasn't broken the covenant, right?
Right.
context, God is actually reassuring him and saying, "No, you have my favor. You have my favor. I will go with you." Right? Things like that. So of course, distance had been created with the people, yes,
Right.
but I guess I would be a little bit uncomfortable to say that that's is also impacting
And
Moses.
Moses isn't being included in that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
Okay.
maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong there, but yeah,
It's
that's
literally just a thought off the top of my head, which is why I wanted to ask you, because I've got a scholar here who studied it. But
yeah.
that's part of I do a thing. I do a podcast weekly with Michael Halcomb over at Glossa House, and we do a thing called 10 questions, and we just literally pull up a Bible verse from a random Bible verse generator, and then we take turns asking questions about
Mhm.
the text, and we don't give answers. We just ask questions, and it's like real time interrogating the text. And so one of the things we say is, doesn't mean that every question you have is going to be a hit. Like, it's not
Right.
always going to yield something, but that's what reading your section made me think about is why is there a difference, at least in some way, that didn't
Yeah.
seem to. So it's
Yeah.
hopefully readers will go back and read Exodus 32 30 through 34 with new eyes and get
Yeah.
a new understanding of it. But you mentioned brief. Oh, go ahead.
I also want to point out, I think there's actually a lot of intimacy in this picture, right?
Right.
Where he says, there is a place by me. In the Hebrew, there is et with me,
Hmm.
right? And when it actually happens, it does mention that, again, that he is, but beside the Lord. It's like he's standing together with Yahweh.
Hmm.
Uh, so to me, it's actually quite intimate picture rather than a distant picture.
Yeah.
I think it's this concern that he can't see God directly.
Hmm.
Just that is still, he has to be protected. Yeah. Anyway, go on. You had
Yeah.
another question.
Well, no, you mentioned in that same incident Moses' face shining, and there's a
Mhm.
fun discussion. It's in a footnote, but on page 48, you talk about the tradition as an artist. You of course have seen pictures, and people watching may have seen pictures of Moses, famous sculptures and paintings of Moses where he literally has horns. In
Yes.
some of them, he kind of, you look at that and you think, is that Pan? Is that the devil? Is what's going on? Why does Moses have horns? And you touch
Yeah.
on that in the book. Where did that tradition come from of these
Yeah.
Karen
Yeah.
that Moses has?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's in chapter 34. Yeah. Verses 29 and 30 and 35, they all mention the skin of his face shone. And so it's a question of how you translate karan, the verb there. As I mean, I translate it as shine or shone in that context. But the reason why there's the question of whether it should be horned, something like that, it's related to the fact that there is a noun karen, which means horn.
Mm.
And there's a Hiphil participle. There's a verb in the Psalm 69, where it could be translated as the horn of an ox or bull or something like that. but I mean, this translation of horns, it really comes from the Vulgate. The Vulgate is the Latin translation of the
Mm.
old of the Bible by Jerome and in Bethlehem. So so that then carried on into Middle Ages in terms of translation. But if you look at the ancient manuscripts, none of them translate this as horned. The Septuagint actually uses the word glory, that he glorified his face, and so
Mm.
I checked out the new translation of the Septuagint, the Net's Bible, and
Mm.
his face was charged with glory. So the ancient witnesses, none of them talk about horns.
Yeah.
I know some scholars, and so I think it's because of the translation issue that came through the Vulgate, which
Mm.
then went into medieval art. There are some who try to make a case regarding the kind of ancient Near Eastern masks with horns in kind of cultic context. But there's nothing in chapter 34 that is indicating some kind of cultic mask or something like
Yeah.
that. I actually would recommend Joshua Philpott. I mean, I reference him in that section. He wrote a very good article on this, which he explains all the various views of how to translate it, but then he explains why we should just simply understand it as it's shining. Some people want to connect it with the horns of the calf, the golden calf, which or mimicking that, and I find that a little bit of an odd way of translating it, because that section is condemned, right? They're not supposed to
Right.
be being a golden calf. So why would Moses be mimicking the golden calf. That doesn't
Yeah.
make sense to me.
Yeah.
And it doesn't say that he sprouts horns from his head. I mean, Joshua Philpott points out it says that the skin of his face. Like if
Mhm.
Moses had horns coming from his face, then it would be obvious. He would know. And it says that Moses doesn't know that his face is shining,
Yeah.
right? So I would refer you to Joshua Philpott's article. He's very good at dealing with this, and
Mhm.
I did that in that footnote. So I think that the plain meaning is that his face has been it's radiating with God's glory. It's reflecting because
Yeah.
had this fantastic encounter, and now that the notion of glory associated with light and radiance is very prominent in Scripture. So it's not surprising that his face is shining,
Yeah.
but it's a translation kind of from the Vulgate and then into medieval art,
Yeah.
and then
It's an it fascinates me because it's something that like once a word gets mistranslated or misinterpreted in translation into Latin, that sets the course for 1,000 years of
yeah,
how it's going to be read. And so you have this 1,000-year period where people create these traditions of Moses having horns because they misread the verb to shine as the word for horn. And some people, I've even heard some try to say, no, it's like horns of light, like that those are rays of light. It's a phenomenological way of describing. And I'm like, all right. I mean, that's going a long way to preserve the idea that doesn't need preserving in the first place.
yeah.
Those are the kind of things to me that are really interesting
Mhm.
because of their cultural, like
Yeah.
some people are probably watching this going, what are you guys even talking about? I've never, but people who've done art history, if you've had to study art history, if you've had to look at, Michelangelo's carving of Moses,
Yeah.
he's got horns and they're
Yes.
very prominent. And it's because of this
Yeah.
tradition that it's part of like the whole angels and halos and all of that kind of, it's fascinating to me how we get to these popular understandings based on
Mhm.
biblical or lexical misunderstandings.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, it was an aside, but it was an interesting aside. Then you talked about later around page 57, you got into something that really resonates with me because of the series that we've done here on Mount Sinai and on the tabernacle, which is that, and you quote Milgram,
Hmm.
Jacob Milgram, saying that basically because of the theophany, the presence of God filling the tabernacle, it becomes like a Mount Sinai in miniature.
Hmm.
Talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that. What's the significance of that? How is the tabernacle in any way like Mount Sinai?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a good point. A lot of scholars make this point. But Jacob Milgram, yeah, is really tying it in with Sinai and the tabernacle. But it's because God's presence is manifest in both places. Like the mountain of God becomes a mountain of revelation,
Mhm.
and of course God's glory and presence is there. But then when the tabernacle is finally built, he's fulfilling the covenant promise. I'm going to dwell among my people. I'm going to, you're my people, and I'm your God, and I'm going to dwell among you. And so the sort of God sort of moves in, so to speak, when he fills the tabernacle with his glory. And so because of that, the tabernacle also becomes this place of God's revelation, God's presence, just like it was at Sinai. And so when you then continue looking at this theme in scripture, you find also that Sinai becomes equivalent of Zion, or Zion becomes equivalent of Sinai. And
Mhm.
so when the temple is built, the glory of God fills the temple. And then, of course, the notion of Zion and the place where God dwells, it's all connected again, this parallelism between Sinai and Zion, and the parallel patterns between the tabernacle and the temple, right? So it's emphasizing this place of God's revelation that now continues in the form of the tabernacle, becomes this mobile home, journeying with God, journeying with the people,
Yeah.
God's presence. So yeah, so it becomes part of a larger theme of Sinai and Zion and God's presence, and even the notion of the tabernacle being kind of a antitype of the cosmic temple, of all creation being a cosmic temple, and that you have this replica of God filling his um, cosmic temple on the earth as well. So those other themes also tied
Yeah.
into
I
there.
like that you said God's mobile home. That's actually what we titled the video in that series here at Disciple Dojo was God's mobile home. That he decides to pack it in and move in with Israel, so to speak, to dwell among them in the
Yeah,
dwelling, the Mishkan.
that's right.
And
Yeah.
yeah, if viewers, if you're interested in that, I'll link the video below because it's fascinating how when you start to see the tabernacle. I think part of the problem with people seeing the tabernacle in the mountain is the mountains are vertical and the tabernacle is laid out in concentric
Mm,
gradations of access. But if you were to kind of stretch the tabernacle up, so to speak,
right.
like one of those children's toys that collapse and you can pull it out and then collapse it. That's how I pictured it as, the tabernacle it's collapsing Mount Sinai and you still
Mhm.
have the concentric, only
Yeah,
the elders can come here and only
yeah,
Moses
that's
and
right.
Joshua. And then at the very top, only the one
Only
and God.
yeah.
We have a lot of that here in the channel, but it was cool to read that in your account and unpack it, how that relates to God's glory,
Hmm.
which is God dwelling among his people
Yeah,
and being there in some tangible way,
yeah.
which is what Isaiah sees. So Isaiah, which you said that's where you spend a lot of time, that's what you teach on, and that's a significant section of the book when you deal with the glory in Isaiah. What new, I don't want to say what new thing, but what is added to concepts of God's glory from Isaiah that as we're building our theology of God's glory, what does Isaiah now bring to the table that is particularly enlightening or illuminating?
Yeah. Yeah. I entitled that chapter of Isaiah "God's Glory in Zion" because there is this emphasis on Zion theology and God's glory being seen in Zion or in Jerusalem, and you have a picture of theophany happening in chapter 4, where you've got the glory as a canopy over the city, and so. Yeah, it's not just in the temple, but you got God's divine protection, and then you in chapter 24 you got the elders sitting before God and seeing the King in His glory and things like that. So so you interesting, and you have a lot of emphasis on Zion, but Zion, it again is one of these terms that has more than one nuance of meaning. Like in Isaiah and in many of the prophets will talk about daughters of Zion or the people of Zion. So Zion becomes a substitute even for the people of God. And so in Isaiah 60, you got, arise, shine, for your light has come, for the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. But it's addressing Zion. You can see it in the verbal forms, and like it's using feminine pronouns there for, because in the ancient world, cities were seen as feminine. But you can see that it's including the people, right? What's also interesting about Isaiah is that you got this kind of emphasis on the universal revelation or very inclusive revelation of God's
Yeah.
glory. Up until, I mean, throughout the Pentateuch and in the historical books, you've got it's Israel who sees God's glory, and it's the Solomon and Moses and special people along the way who experience God's glory. But when you get to the prophets, in particular Isaiah, is very much emphasizing that okay, God's glory has been revealed to his people, but this is not reserved only for Israel. This is something that is reserved for the world.
Mm.
All flesh will see God's glory. All nations will see God's glory. All creation and we'll see God's glory. We see this in Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 40, and then Isaiah 60 and Isaiah 66. Like by the end of the book, the nations are all coming to Jerusalem and streaming. In fact, in the beginning of the book, too, in Isaiah 2, the nations are coming and streaming.
Right.
But by the end of the book, it's mentioning that they're coming to experience God's presence and his glory. And they are to go and tell others, to declare his glory among the nations and bring everyone, everyone, Israelites and non-Israelites, Gentiles, everyone come and see my glory and be, so it's like Zion then becomes like a magnet, like the transformation of God's people becomes a magnet that draws the nations to God, which
Mm.
is just, I think, a very distinctive aspect of Isaiah
It's
as well.
when it's unexpected too, the concept, you mentioned it at page 210, you talked about how the broadening of the priesthood
Mm-hmm.
to include Gentiles. I
Yeah.
mean, the priesthood didn't even include all Israelites in
No.
its literal setting. And now in Isaiah,
Yeah.
you have it including even Gentiles. What in the world? What is happening there?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So if you look at the final chapter of Isaiah 66, you have references to the Gentiles becoming priests and Levites and offering the Israelites and bringing offerings to the
Hmm.
Lord by the final chapter. But what's interesting is the final chapters of Isaiah. If you start in chapter 56, you've got the foreigner and the eunuch, right, who
Hmm.
has joined themselves to the Lord and I'm going to keep the covenant and keep the Sabbath, that they should not feel like they're separated. And you get, the passage that the house of the Lord is a house for all nations, right? So you almost have, I mean, some scholars say an inclusio, right? Inclusio is this, you have a theme at the beginning of a section and you have a theme at the end of that section. And so you're tying together that the foreigners can be part of the covenant people of God and not rejected and that God will gather others as well. And then at the end of the book, it has this beautiful picture of all nations coming, and not just coming to worship, but that they will also be priests and Levites and offering sacrifices. But here, I mean, I think it's tied into how the New Testament speaks of us as the priesthood of all believers, like that text from Exodus 19 is then applied to the church in 1 Peter 2, right? That we
Right.
are a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, a chosen people, holy, kingdom priests, a holy nation, etc.
That's what I
So
was going to ask you. Do you see the New Testament looking at this section of Isaiah and going, guys, this is starting to happen already? Like Gentiles are coming in, and we like,
yeah,
whereas some people would look at the Isaiah passage and say, oh, that hasn't happened yet. That's a future thing completely. And it's going to be literal. So that means the church has to be raptured out of the world in order for like it becomes this whole kind of juggling act.
yeah. No, I think that it's already happening. I mean, of course, the First Peter 2 passage is a quotation from Exodus 19, right?
Mhm.
That's in that context, it is applied to Israel. But even there says that I'm the Lord of all the earth, right? Like there is a notion that God is still Lord of everything, right? All nations and everything. So, but yes, I mean, that's of course is applied in the New Testament. That concept of being a royal priesthood and the priesthood of all believers, I think,
Mhm.
is drawing on. I mean, it is particularly drawing in Exodus 19, but it's being reinforced by these other passages like in Isaiah 66 as well.
Right. Which is
Yeah.
where the servant is, that later Isaiah 40 through 66, the servant is said to be covenant, making a covenant with the people and a light to the nations or a light to the
Yes.
Gentiles.
Yeah.
So the New Testament authors, yeah, I mean, I could just imagine the road to Emmaus, Jesus pointing out these kind of things, being like, guys, read
Yeah.
carefully.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
speaking of Isaiah,
Hmm.
you have Isaiah 6.
Hmm.
There's a translation issue, and I'd love for you to share that with you, the traditional translation, and then how you suggest the Hebrew text actually be translated and what the significance of that is.
Yeah. 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 I deal about that on page 158 if anyone wants to check afterwards. But yeah, so traditionally Hebrews 6, the Isaiah chapter 6, verse 3 is translated, traditionally holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty, or the Lord of hosts, the whole earth is full of his glory, right? That's
Mm.
traditional English. Most English Bibles take that. I don't know if there's any English Bible that doesn't do that, but that's actually coming out of the the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Greek Septuagint translation. But if you read the Hebrew text in the what we call the Masoretic text, the Hebrew translation of the Old Testament, there in that Hebrew text. It really actually says the fullness of the whole earth is his glory.
Mm.
Or you could say his glory is the fullness of all the earth. So the word fullness, I mean, it's actually not a verb. And so when we're saying it, the whole earth is full of his glory, like it's actually in a construct state. If you understand the kind of the genitive, the fullness of the whole earth is his glory. And that has implications for how you view creation. I mean, creation is declaring the glory of God, right? The Psalm 19 talks about that constantly, a witness to God's glory. But this passage is actually equating creation with God's glory, and so in that section, there's quite a few scholars who take this position: Christopher Wright, Hugh Williamson, Richard Middleton, our friend. But what's interesting is that it then makes us think about creation in a different way, that at least some part of God's glory is actually his creation itself. The whole universe is his glory, and it's tied into Yahweh being king, and this is his kingdom. He's got a glorious kingdom because he is glorious, and so I like also that what Christ writes also highlights the word fullness in this passage. It's not just that the whole earth is his glory, but it's the fullness of the whole earth is his glory. And that's emphasizing sort of the words of teeming abundance of creation. Mm-hmm. The earth is full of God's glory, for what fills the earth constitute at least one dimension of God's glory. So of course, God's glory is also above creation and beyond, and the transcendence of God's glory we see as well. But here you also see there's at least one dimension of God's glory that's actually seen in creation. And that has implications for creation care. Of course, that brings us back to Genesis 1 about being good stewards of God's creation. But if you actually see creation, not just only witnessing to God's glory, but actually being part of his kingdom, which is his kingdom is a glorious kingdom. It is his glory, or at least the abundance of it and the goodness of it,
right.
Beauty of it is what, at least partly, what constitutes his glory. And then I think it should also has implications of how we treat God's world that we live in.
That's a very subtle point that a lot of people might easily miss. They might say, okay, so the Septuagint, the earth is filled with his glory. What's the difference between that and the fullness of the earth is his glory? But like you're saying, and I don't want viewers to miss this, if you go with the traditional reading, Septuagint reading, it could lead you to think that Isaiah is saying you have the earth and God's glory is some external thing that comes and like fills it up.
Yeah.
And whereas the Hebrew text is saying the earth being full, complete, whole, teeming, abundant, like the earth being what God created it to be, that's a manifestation of his glory. That is his glory. Yeah. And so viewers, if this seems a little esoteric, it really has big implications, because it teaches us to look at to pray for, long for, and work for God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That this is creation care is not a pagan concept. It's not a hippie granola, Mother Earth goddess. Any of that stuff is not left wing. It's not woke. It's not any of the. It is biblical theology caring for, protecting, stewarding this creation, because creation and its fullness is part of God's glory.
Yeah.
And a lot of, especially among, I'm evangelical, especially among my evangelical tribe, that has gotten downplayed because the whole goal has become, well, just get as many souls off this dying rock as we can so that they can go to heaven. And you just don't see that in the Bible, Old or New Testament. That was a really interesting and fascinating point that I want I want viewers, hopefully readers of the book, but viewers to pick up on, is even just a little one verse.
Yeah.
How you interpret it has huge ramifications.
Very true.
Well, let's move on. We're coming close to about an hour, so I want to ask you two more. I want to ask you about Ezekiel and Habakkuk, and then we had some viewer questions that we'll let you take a stab at. But what does Ezekiel contribute to our understanding of God's glory in particular?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what's interesting about Ezekiel is that he encounters, this fantastic theophany or vision encounter with Yahweh in exile, and I think that's extremely important. That because of the notion that many had that God's glory only dwelt in the temple, or this notion that Israel now was abandoned, they are in exile, they're far away from God. And of course Ezekiel was supposed to be in Jerusalem. He's a priest, right? And he's not getting a chance to fulfill his calling as a priest. And so in the context of being called to be a prophet, he has this amazing vision of the Lord, and it says that it ends with saying that this is a vision of the glory of the Lord, right? In chapter 1, it concludes with saying that, and coming on this divine chariot with cherubim and wheels, and a very bizarre kind of picture. But again, it has the smoke and it has the gleaming metal and fire and a human being that's partly on fire, right? But finding it hard to even describe the vision, right? He's comparing like this or like that.
Yeah, it's always like something.
Yeah, like something. That's right. And when you get to the end, it's like this and like that. Yeah, at the end, but it's in the midst of being far away from the temple, far away from Jerusalem, that Ezekiel actually has this encounter with Yahweh, and it's in the form of his glory, right? And that becomes very reassuring that God is not tied to one piece of territory, or is not tied to the land of Israel or the temple. He can go anywhere. He's the Lord of the universe. But he's chosen to show himself in a particular way to Ezekiel. We don't have examples in Ezekiel that the rest of the people see the glory. All the encounters emphasize his example, what Ezekiel. So it's kind of the reassuring of that. But in chapter 11, he talks about that I will be a sanctuary for you for a while. It's like God's bringing his sanctuary into to exile with his people. So it's a very reassuring picture. At the same time, there's connotations of judgment associated with the vision as well. Right. For those who don't know the book of Ezekiel, I love teaching book of Ezekiel, and most people are afraid of the book of Ezekiel because it has some strange things in it. But it's framed by these visions of God's glory. So you got chapters 1 to 3, you actually have two different visions right at the beginning, and then 7 days later, he has another vision of God's glory. But then in chapters 8 through 11, he has another vision where Ezekiel's transported to Jerusalem, and he watches in slow motion the glory of God leaving the temple. And of course, there's very ominous because judgment is about to be poured out on Jerusalem. You have to remember, while Ezekiel's having these visions, there's still people living back in Judah, right? The kingdom hasn't fallen yet, but Ezekiel actually learns that the kingdom will fall and the temple will be destroyed. And so we have, in slow motion, he sees God's glory leaving the Holy of Holies and going slowly up to the eastern mountain, Mount of Olives, probably to the east. But so this picture of removal, protection before the Babylonians come to destroy, right? But then, of course, the book ends with a grand vision. Again, the glory of the Lord returns by the end of the book, right? In chapter 43 and 44. Mm-hmm. But you can also see the presence of God's glory even in 47 with the Spirit, or the pouring of the water coming from the throne room, because the glory is in the throne room of the most holy place, and then it's transforming everything, including the Dead Sea becomes fresh water, right? So those final chapters, it brings a lot of hope of God's presence returning. And then you also get in chapter 39 talking about the nations. Here you have a text about the nations experiencing God's glory as well, both in the judgment of Gog, this strange we don't how to translate who's Gog, but that in the judgment of Gog, but also in the judgment that Israel experienced for having been driven into exile. But then it becomes a picture of hope again, salvation for Israel, that they will be able to return to the land. And so even though there's this ominous, you know what I mean? Yeah, notion with that vision between chapter 8 through 11, it does end on a hopeful note that God promises that he will come back, he will restore his people. and that he will return with his presence to his temple. So it's very powerful. And that frames the whole book with that, with the vision at the beginning and the middle and then the end as well.
Yeah. And of course, and the author of Revelation is drawing heavily on the
Yes.
whole
Yeah.
image bank that Ezekiel is filled with when we get Revelation. I always have to read those two books in tandem, or at least read Revelation with an eye towards Ezekiel in a lot of places, in
Yeah.
God's glory. Yeah, there. Viewers, catch the interview we did with Dr. Beth Stovell a couple of weeks ago, I think last month, when she was on, and we talked more about Ezekiel. Because I agree with you, Ezekiel is a book that people are shy away from, but it's great. I think because it's so close to being apocalyptic. You need a guide. Most people need their handheld to walk them through the book because it's strange and scary and bizarre. But when once you have the lay of it and understand what type of literature it is, then like you said, it becomes incredibly comforting and some of the best promise. One of the clearest new covenant promises, Ezekiel 36. Just this beautiful picture of restoration. And read Ezekiel, folks. Read Ezekiel. Yes. It's worth it. Well, let's wrap up with the last near the end of the book. You talk about Habakkuk and how Habakkuk has in 2:14 he talks about not just God's glory, the earth is filled with the knowledge of the glory of God.
So it's very interesting. So this is Habakkuk 2:14, right? And I titled that section "The Universal Knowledge of God's Glory." The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So what's interesting that part is part of a section, like some people refer to as the taunt song with 5 wool oracles. And so this is part of the 3rd wool oracle. And it almost seems out of place in that 3rd wool oracle, which is 12 to 14. So that wool oracle begins saying that, that those who are building a city based on the bloodshed and injustice are going to be, judged. And so it's probably referring to the Babylonians, right? Because Habakkuk is struggling with this view that God is going to use the Babylonians to punish his people. So this section is actually reassuring the prophet that there will be justice for you. The enemy, the Babylonians, will eventually be punished, and we know that the kingdom was destroyed, and but that there is going to be justice in that context. So there is a divine reckoning, and what the Babylonians have done is really futile in the end. And so in the middle of, that concludes that oracle with this picture that one day the whole earth will be filled with this knowledge of the glory of the Lord. So some people will refer to this as a judgment theophany. Carrie Newman uses that language as a revelation of God's going to judge, right, in the context of a oracle. But it also becomes at the same time a message of hope. So all the injustices that have happened, God will judge. He's a divine judge who hates wickedness, who loves justice, right? But it's also a reassuring word that people will acknowledge. So the word yada, or which translated here in da'at, or like as a knowledge, it can also have a notion of acknowledge or recognize, right? So that the nations of the world, as well as God's people, will actually recognize the sovereignty of God, and that his right to judge, and that he is divine judge, and that becomes a message of hope, that injustice will be taken care of. One day God will set things right. And that whole section ends with God being in the temple. And so this picture of this divine judge there as part of that picture. What's also interesting is that expression. So it's both acknowledging God's sovereignty and right to judge, and it brings hope. But it's also interesting that it's almost the verse is almost identical to another verse in the book of Isaiah, right? In Isaiah chapter 11:9, where again that passage in the context of the Davidic king, and many will say that's a messianic passage, but it talks about a time when they will not hurt or destroy on my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters covers the sea. So in that passage, it doesn't say the glory of the Lord, but it does use everything else there, saying the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Again, this kind of universal picture everywhere. Everyone will know the Lord. Everyone will acknowledge the Lord. But in that context, it gives a kind of messianic interpretation with the seed of David and the Davidic king. So it's interesting to hear those together, knowing one is talking more about judgment, but there in Isaiah is talking more about the messianic kingdom, and when all things, there will be no more war, no more, and all the animals will get along and all of that. So, yeah.
It ties in with Jeremiah too, in the promise of the new covenant. It says, "No one will say, 'Know the Lord,' for they will all know me, from the least to the greatest." Yeah. That knowledge. Do you think it's an experience? Do you think it's traditionally people say the word know doesn't just mean knowledge intellectually, it means experience, or it has more than just intellectual knowledge. There's an element of which then they say that's why, Adam knew his wife, or the knowledge of good and evil becomes experience of good and evil. Do you think that can be somewhat in the semantic domain, or do you think it's Habakkuk and what Jeremiah and others are talking about is more of just acknowledging, like recognizing, like you said?
That's a good question. I mean, I do think in the context of Jeremiah 31, right, and that new covenant, I do think it definitely is experiential. There is a sense, I think there is much more of that recognized here in Jeremiah. Whether that is what's happening in Habakkuk, I know people say Habakkuk or Habakkuk, but
yeah, I'm from the South, so we say Habakkuk, but that's because we say tobacco.
Anyway, but whether that's exactly what I think in the context of a woe oracle about the Babylonians, I probably think it's more acknowledgement, just like the Egyptians, like the Pharaoh and the Egyptians. They will also know that the Yahweh, but I don't know. I wouldn't say that Pharaoh had a personal, experiential, close relationship with Yahweh. Right. But he, is an acknowledgement, right? And the Egyptian acknowledge, this is the finger of God. This is, God working. So I do think that, even with Joshua and the Israelites entering the promised land, that Gentiles there, or the nations, are aware of what, hearing the stories about the miraculous exodus from Egypt, and it's sort of this acknowledgement, this God is sovereign, this God of Israel. And so I think maybe in Habakkuk it's probably more of that, the whole earth, that there will be a time where everyone will bow their knee, whether they had acknowledged God before or this time. Although, only God knows. I can't say for sure. It could be also this picture that, there could be a reference to experiential. But I guess I'm thinking more in the context of a judgment oracle. Right. I think it's more of an acknowledgement, probably, especially if it's talking about Babylonians. Because I don't have a historical, mass conversion of Babylonians coming to faith in the God.
Even if the experiential wasn't a good experience, like if it was experiencing, you'll know the glory of the Lord.
It is true that this is where, again, there's a whole semantic domain, right? There's a whole. You look at all the passages of where yada, or the word for no, you will get slightly different translations. So again. There are, for sure, places where it definitely is experiential. But whether we should apply that to every occurrence, I would be a little bit careful about saying for every occurrence. What
is it? The fallacy of illegitimate totality transfer. I think it's be careful of that. The book, guys, if you're watching, I just pulled some excerpts from it that I wanted to ask Rebecca about in person, but check out the book and read through it. And it walks through this concept, this overlooked concept of God's glory, or not even overlooked, but misunderstood concept of God's glory, and what it means. That before we can figure out what it means theologically. Like, what do we mean when we talk about the glory of God? Before we can figure out what it means in our church setting today, we should know what it meant in Israel and what it meant throughout the scriptures of Israel, because that's what the New Testament authors were presuming. They were pulling from and building upon, not making something completely different. And so that's why I think the importance of your work, I think it lies there in grounding people in the Old Testament concepts of what is God's glory and how multifaceted it is, how it can't just be. Somebody asked one of the viewer questions, actually the first one somebody asked was, just give me a basic definition of glory, because I'm confused. There's so many. and I was like, yeah, there's a whole book full of aspects to it. But we'll look at some other viewer questions as well. But in all seriousness, how would you answer a layperson, somebody comes up to you that's like, yeah, my preacher was talking about glory, and I don't know what they mean. What's give me something to wrap my non-scholarly mind around the concept of God's glory. How would you frame it in that situation?
If you're talking about just the word glory versus what the glory of God is, glory also has a huge kind of a semantic range of meanings, that is connected to, worth and honor and gravitas. And so when we talk about giving God glory, we're giving him honor and acknowledging his worth and gravitas, like that he is worth the worship that we give to him. And glory can mean abundance or riches as well, and wealth and things like that. But when we're specifically talking about God's glory, related to not just looking at the word glory or kavod, but looking at actually God's glory. I mean, and one in the Old Testament is often associated with God's presence. So some translations of Isaiah 6:3, and then the Jewish publication translation, it says that his presence fills the earth, right? So the glory of God is equated with God's manifest presence, especially when in the Pentateuch, where you have there's actually indication that God is present in more visible signs of his presence. So sometimes just a general reference to God's glory has to do with his manifest presence and being seen or visibly manifest in different passages. But then the problem is that it doesn't always mean that. That's what I'm trying to point out in my book, that there's the portrait of God's glory is multifaceted.
Right.
So you'll get theologians who will talk about God's glory being more connected to his character, right? The divine attributes, his excellence, his holiness, his goodness, his compassion. And as I deal with that in the Exodus 33-34 passage. So that sometimes it's not so simple. There isn't a simple definition. That's what I guess I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And that's a valid answer that a lot of people may not like, but it's still a valid answer.
Yeah.
Is some things don't have a simple, simple definition.
So that's what I'm trying to show in my book, is that you got to look at the passage. What does it mean in this passage? What does it mean in this book? Yeah.
You used the word gravitas, and that just piqued my interest, because way back 20 years ago when I was learning Hebrew, exegeting, one of my professors said, talking about kavod and just how the basic concept that it has to do with is weight or heaviness, and he suggested that at times God's glory, God's kavod at times is like it's like it's so present that you can feel it, or it's thick, or it's heavy, the heavy knot. And it's interesting that that term gravitas has floated into our English lexicon, which means heavy, having weight.
Or weighty.
Weighty, yeah. And we even talk about a weighty matter, a weighty issue. And we don't literally mean you can put it on a scale and weigh it, but we mean it's important. It's heavy. And I feel like, do you think that there's some of that in kavod, that there's a weightiness? Not, again, you can't put it on a scale, but it's that gravitas, like you said.
Yeah. So what's interesting, there's actually a scholarly debate around how to translate kavod
Hmm.
and whether there is a connection to weightiness. And so the adjective kaved clearly does have examples of heavy or weight or even severe, and the famine being severe. And so, but there are some scholars will say, no, we should separate the concept of weight from the concept of kavod related to God.
Hmm.
Um, at the same time, I actually can see the connection when you look at about the notion of kavod, the fact that you're acknowledging that God's character and his nature is such that he is worth our honor and glory because of his gravitas of who he is, that he's the God above all gods, right? He
Hmm.
is the King of Kings and etc. So the notion, I mean, I think this is where we get the notion of honor. Like many Bibles will translate, when we give God glory or
Yeah.
give God honor, we are acknowledging his gravitas. We're acknowledging that he has authority. He
Hmm.
is powerful. This is the God we worship. So I personally do think that there is somewhat a connection, even though I know there's a debate and some scholars won't agree with me if, to
Right.
separate that. But there is, and so it is interesting that especially in the Pentateuch, when you get these experiences of God's glory, especially when it's filling the tabernacle and then later the temple. And in Ezekiel's response, like he falls on his face
Hmm.
in worship and bows down, right? And the priests can't enter into the tabernacle and Moses, I should say, Moses as well can't enter in because of the. So to me, there is something about the presence of God that's so powerful, so palpable, or so intense that you can almost describe it as weighty or
Right.
presence or weighty presence of
Yeah.
God. Um, uh, and uh, and so the response of the priests, so the response of Moses, or the response of Ezekiel, is that either bow down, or you can't enter because it's so powerful. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I do think there is something about the presence of God that can be palpable or can
Hmm.
be weighty in a sense.
Yeah. There's a
But to
thickness
acknowledge it,
to it.
there is a debate about how to
Right.
translate.
Well, yeah, like with most things, there is some scholarly debate somewhere for sure. But it's also good to hear. I intuitively, I think it's always made sense. I mean, it helped me get through Hebrew vocabulary, at least, is thinking about God's thick presence.
Yes. Yeah.
But your book was good in pointing out that it's not a one, like it's manifest in different ways. And so while you can kind of keep that as base camp, you have to be willing to climb out into some other ranges and see some other meanings that the term has, or nuances that it has.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, folks, if you're interested in this concept, check out Show Me Your Glory and see what you think. But I asked viewers to submit questions, and there were a bunch of them. We don't have time to get through all of them, but we have about three or four that I would love for you to take a quick stab at. And I'll read the viewer name. I'll put it on the screen because if people were nice enough to submit their comment, I want to give them recognition. So Dean Bobar 4988 asked the question, what is the relationship between God's glory and God's holiness to God's salvation? So where does salvation fit into, you know, I assume that's what he's asking, but I don't know. How would you answer? What would you say to Dean Bobar?
All right. So it's a very good question. So the first part is connecting what's the relationship between God's glory and God's holiness. And so many scholars will say that the glory of God is that kind of external manifestation of that kind of intrinsic internal characteristic of God is holy. And so in some passage of scripture, the glory of God meets out judgment, and it's because people have sinned, and it's because God is holy, and His nature is holy, that you see the glory of God meeting out judgment, because it's actually demonstrating the character of God in a kind of a manifest external way, right? With the glory of God, and even the image of fire as being dangerous and also as purifying. and consecrating, all of those kind of that image or that metaphor is also tied into the holy nature of God, but then seen externally as this fire that it also purifies and also judges as well. But the relationship between God and God's glory and God's salvation, I mean, I think that that's demonstrated several times in the Old Testament, and of course, also in the New Testament. But this notion of that God's glory is revealed when God acts in salvific ways, like that God redeems. Like, in the book of Exodus, with the story of the Exodus, that's where you actually get the first references to God's glory and God being glorified in the rescuing his people from Egyptian slavery. And so that's the notion of God's glory being revealed in redemption is very, very clear in the whole story of the Exodus. And then, of course, in Isaiah, it's also tied together with salvation, and that's a big theme in Isaiah, that of God's glory seen in salvation. And of course, Jesus ultimately is the full revelation of God's glory, and the New Testament brings that in. Of course, Jesus is our Savior. As a Christian, I believe that. So God's glory is revealed in the person of Jesus Christ, who then ultimately saves us. So there is definitely a connection between God's glory being revealed and the salvific work of God, of the saving God. Yeah.
So J Ship 5 had a question, and this is a quick one because I think you've answered it in our discussion, asked, does God's glory refer to his presence? And you mentioned the New Jerusalem translation. Sometimes it translates glory as presence. So
yeah.
There was a user, I can't even try to say the name because it's just a string of letters and numbers because that's what YouTube, I guess, assigned them. But they asked, did the Shekinah leave Israel at the time of Ezekiel? Did it ever come back? And then they said, given that Jesus said not to swear by the temple, given that God dwells in it.
Yeah, so I actually have a section on this in the chapter 9 on the book related to the minor prophets. I conclude the whole section on the minor prophets with the question of whether God's presence or God's glory returned to the temple after it was rebuilt, after during the Persian period after exile. And now, what's interesting is that there is a diversity of views on this and diversity of opinions among scholars, and also diversity of opinion within the rabbinic literature and some of the intertestamental literature as well of how to interpret that. But what's interesting is that text that the person quoted from Matthew 23:21 is very interesting because it seems to imply that Jesus is saying that if you swear by the temple, you're swearing by the one who dwells in the temple. And in Matthew 5, he also talks about swearing by the city of the great king, right? And so both those passages seem to imply that God is dwelling in the temple. And I think the New Testament also, Jesus is very concerned about how they're treating my Father's house, right? And so you have passages that talk about that as well, which seems to imply that God is dwelling in his house, and so you got to treat it properly. You have the beginning of Luke, you have Zechariah encountering this angel while he's doing service in the temple, and it says that he's ministering before the Lord. They even uses that expression in Greek there, before the Lord in the temple. And then, of course, Anna is in the temple praying day and night, right? Praying and seeking God. So the New Testament writer those passages seem to imply that God's presence is in the temple, right? And so that led, I was actually talking to Mark Boda about this, and he actually pointed me to his doctoral supervisor, Graham Davis, had written an article on this, that he is actually pointing out that even in the biblical material and the Second Temple Judaism material, the intertestamental period, and also in Second Temple material, that there's a diversity of views on this. Did God's glory and presence return or not? And some scholars will say, no, it didn't return because we don't have a passage of scripture that explicitly says that God returned. However, I think it can clearly, I will argue that it actually is implied in many texts. If you look at Haggai and Zechariah, but Haggai is talking about that, he's commanding them to rebuild the temple, right?
Mhm.
And he says, I'm going to, uh, I will be glorified when I do this, when you do this, when it's rebuilt, right? There's a sense of favor associated with that, and that he's going to fill this house with glory. Of course, it's talking about the wealth of the nations, but Mark Boda in his commentary actually sees a double entendre there. There could be an allusion to the glory of God filling the temple when it's rebuilt. And my colleague John Kessler, the late John Kessler, he passed away this year, also argued that in his Haggai commentary. So so I mean, the vision in Ezekiel at the end is giving them hope that God is going to return. And so it is possible, at least that they understood that God's glory would return from that vision, right? And then if you look at the Ezra and Nehemiah and the accounts there, the whole purpose of the rededication of the temple and the offering sacrifices, you find in Ezra and Nehemiah are concerned about the house of the Lord, and they are going there to worship and to pray. And then throughout the prophets, you have references to my house, right? And then if you look at Psalms, there's some Psalms, depending on if you see them as post-exilic Psalms, but there is I'm just trying to think. Graham Davis brings up Psalm 135, where it talks about blessed is the Lord from Zion, he who resides in Jerusalem, and he does think this is from the post-exilic period. It's talking about God dwelling in Jerusalem and implied by the dwelling in the temple. And if you, depending how you date Joel is saying the same thing. So for those who think that's post-exilic, I know there's a debate about Joel, but if it is post-exilic, Joel is also talking about God residing in Jerusalem. And this is, so there are passages that seem to imply that God's presence returned, even though we don't have, a description of a full description. There definitely were promises that I will return, I will dwell among you. If you rebuild my temple, you need to rebuild it, right? There's a reason why he wants them to rebuild. So that's my answer. So you could read a longer version of that in my book.
Yeah. I don't think you touched on it in the book. I'm not sure, but I know I know Josephus writes about in the Jewish wars that before the temple was destroyed, there's an account he talked about many witnesses heard the sound of God's presence leaving the temple and all of the sound of horses and chariot they heard the sound of all of these things and they took it as God leaving the temple. And then of course the Jewish wars gets destroyed. So at least among some Jews, there was the belief that it was still there until 70 AD when it was finally destroyed. So that's a really good question.
Yeah. Graham Davis actually, he deals with Josephus and he deals with the Talmud, and so he's demonstrating that there is diversity among among the Jewish community at this time as well.
Yeah. Let's do the last one. Somebody asked Pat Tube. So on YouTube, this is Pat Tube. He asked, or they asked, is the glory of God visible or invisible? External or internal? It seems to be both. If so, why is it visible and external at times, but invisible and internal at other times? So I think that's a good concluding question is, why is this so multifaceted? How would you take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I mean, the person is correct, right? It is sometimes visible and external, right? And at times it's invisible or more intrinsic, related to his character, right? You can't just touch it, right? So and so the person is correct. Is the question of why is that? Why is the portrait of God's glory so multifaceted? I mean, I use the metaphor of a painting, but I also talk about Robert Gordon's metaphor of a prism of glory shining through light, and you see different variants of light and color, and that's representing God's character and his ways. James Hamilton talks about God's glory being like a gemstone, where you have different facets of this jewel, of this gemstone. So again, you see, if you're looking at it from one end, you see this emphasis, and you look at it from other end, you see another emphasis, different emphases along the way. So Why? I just think it just says, God is beyond our comprehension, right? But he communicates and reveals himself in multiple ways for us to understand him. And both through his actions, we understand his character actually through his actions. We know that God is good because he's demonstrating his goodness and his grace and compassion, etc. But it just happens to be I just think it's actually the beauty of this concept of God's glory, that it can't just be defined very simply, because it's so much more, because we're studying who God is.
Right.
And it's, yeah. And when I was starting off this project, I mentioned this in the preface about my uncle in Sweden. When he heard I was studying this topic, he says, well, that's an impossible topic. No one can understand God's glory. That was his response. And he really is. I mean, it's in one level, he's correct. We can't, because God is so beyond our human comprehension, but yet he's chosen for us to at least get glimpses of his glory and to understand his glory. I mean, ultimately, in the New Testament, in the coming of Jesus, we see a full revelation of God's glory in Jesus Christ, right, in the incarnation. I'm planning to teach a course this coming winter on the glory of God in the Bible. So I will be dealing with New Testament passages. Some people have said, why didn't you include the New Testament in your book? Well, if it took me 15 years to write this book,
Yeah.
I just feel like I might never have finished the book if I had to do the New Testament, because there's already a lot published on the New Testament, God's glory, New Testament. But I am going to explore that with my students, and perhaps something will come out of that, or maybe an article. I don't know, but
Volume 2, right on the shelf beside it, Volume 2. Well, on that note, I was just going to ask you, for viewers that are interested in going further, your work is covering the Old Testament. Is there anything you found, and you may not, I'm just asking off the cuff, but is there anything you found that is helpful for taking this concept into the New Testament, either any authors or any particular works that do unpack the New Testament and God's glory?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that there's this book called Exploring the Glory of God, New Horizons for Theology of Glory. This came out of that conference, and there were several conferences on God's glory. The one I went to before I had the surgery, but there are some new. This is more. It has some. I mean, my essay is the only Old Testament one, but there is some New Testament articles in here, especially the Gospel of John and the. Those books have a lot about glory,
right,
in Paul's writings, but also in Johanna, and the Gospel of John is really a gospel of glory, right? So there's some essays in there. I did this book called Glory of God. It's an edited collection by Christopher Morgan and Robert Peterson, and they have one chapter on the Old Testament, and that's when that was Tremper Longman's chapter, and I realized, oh, only one chapter on the Old Testament, and the rest is New Testament or theology. Yeah. But this one does cover, texts from the Gospels and from the epistles, and so it does deal with broader, but also from a systematic theology point of view as well. So there are some resources, but there's tons of articles out there, and I will be exploring more as I prepare this course. I'll have a better bibliography for you after I've got the course. But those are a couple of things that came to mind right away.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you, spending the morning with us and chatting about this stuff. I hope viewers are interested, if not in going out and picking up your book, if this is a little too intimidating for them, then at least I hope they're interested in the concept and exploring the topic and reading with an eye towards what is the text saying about God's glory, and not just assuming they know what it means. I think that's the real value in what your work has done, is kind of questioning the assumptions that we may have, and really kind of verifying through the text, where are we getting our concepts of God's glory, and what are we imbibing, stuff that may not be rooted in the text and may just be, traditional added layers. That's the focus. That's why we focus here at Disciple Dojo on original language study and, interacting with scholars and really, really digging into it, because there is so much out there that just sort of lumps onto our theology over time. So I appreciate your book. I was glad to read it, and I think it's really cool what you're doing. So blessings as you teach this course. And if you do come out with a supplemental volume, give me a shout and come back on and talk about it. Folks, if you're interested, also we'll put a link to, if you can send me a link to the books that you just mentioned, or send me the title, and then I'll just put a link where people can go on Amazon and find those if they want. And I'll link to your book as well. Is there anything that we didn't hit that you feel burning in your heart to cover, or have we done it?
Well, no, I just would encourage all of us to pray the prayer, "Show me your glory," and of course, Paul talks about us contemplating or reflecting or beholding the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ and being transformed by that image, right? Yeah. So, just would encourage us to, be willing to pray that kind of prayer as well and make it personal.
Yeah. Amen. I love that. Well, folks, thanks for tuning in. I hope this was an insightful discussion. Hope it piqued your interest and made you want to go back and dig a little deeper. Rebecca, thank you so much for coming on. It's great to have you. I think you're our third Canadian guest here on the channel, which is exciting. International. It's great. Even though you're kind of Toronto's barely international. It's real close. But the Sweden connection is, truly international. So thanks for coming on. Folks, check out Show Me Your Glory. I'll put a link to it in the video description. Take a look.
All right.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. You too.
Once again, I want to thank Dr. Idestrom for coming on and talking to us. I'm going to put all of the links in the video description to not just her book, but other commentary that she's written, as well as some other resources that she recommended and how you can contact her if you'd like to. And we're able to do discussions like this because of you, those of you that watch, support, that like these videos, that donate monthly to Disciple Dojo, that share our content. Your support as viewers is the way that we are able to make things like this happen. So thank you so much to those of you who support the Dojo. Stay tuned for more. We've got cool stuff coming up all the time here. Just enable notifications. That'll let you know what's happening. But that's it for now. We'll see you next time back here at Disciple Dojo. As always, keep training.